Isabella Marino had grown accustomed to the rhythm of exhaustion. It was a steady pulse that beat beneath her ribs, keeping time with the hum of the espresso machine at Café Allegro and the clatter of dinner plates at Trattoria Luna. 2 jobs, 7 days a week, with barely enough hours between shifts to sleep, let alone dream. At 24, she had mastered the art of moving through life on autopilot, smiling when required, translating documents during stolen moments on the subway, and pretending that the hollow ache in her chest was just fatigue and nothing more. New York City had promised her everything when she first arrived from Boston 3 years ago. It had delivered chaos instead. The kind of chaos that swallowed ambition whole and left behind only the skeletal remains of what could have been. She had come here to build a career as a literary translator, to bridge the worlds of Italian poetry and American readers, to honor the language her nonna had whispered to her since childhood. Instead, she found herself translating corporate emails about shipping logistics and wine import regulations, her talent reduced to a commodity measured in words per minute and invoices paid net 30. Tonight, like most nights, Isabella stood behind the bar at Trattoria Luna, watching the dinner crowd with tired eyes. The restaurant was one of those timeless Italian establishments that clung stubbornly to authenticity in a neighborhood rapidly surrendering to fusion concepts and overpriced small plates. Red and white checkered tablecloths, candles dripping wax onto wine bottles, framed photographs of someone's Sicilian ancestors lining the walls. It smelled like garlic, basil, and nostalgia. A scent that should have comforted her but instead reminded her of everything she'd left behind. She had just finished pouring a Chianti for table 7 when the door opened, letting in a gust of October wind, and a man who seemed to carry the weight of the city on his shoulders without breaking a sweat. Isabella noticed him immediately, though she pretended not to. Everyone noticed him. It wasn't just his height or the way his dark gray suit fit him like it had been designed with his specific body in mind, though both were impressive. It was the way he moved through space as if he owned it, as if every room he entered recalibrated itself around his presence. Matteo Romano. She didn't know his name yet, but she would learn it soon enough, along with the warnings that came attached to it. He sat at the corner table, the one reserved for VIPs, and people who tipped in hundreds rather than 20s. His dark hair was swept back in that effortless Italian way that looked artless, but probably required more product than Isabella used in a month. A thin gold chain caught the candlelight at his throat, visible where his crisp white shirt was unbuttoned just enough to suggest he didn't believe in following anyone's rules but his own. His forearms, exposed where he'd rolled his sleeves to his elbows, were decorated with ink, intricate designs that wrapped around muscle and sinew like secrets written on skin. Isabella felt something stir in her chest, a dangerous flutter of interest she immediately crushed beneath the heel of practicality. Men like that were trouble. She'd seen enough of them in her years in the city to recognize the type. Too handsome, too confident, too accustomed to getting exactly what they wanted without having to ask twice. The kind of man who probably thought a smile was currency, and a woman's resistance was just foreplay. She approached his table with her customer service smile firmly in place, the one that was friendly enough to earn tips, but distant enough to discourage conversation. "Good evening. Can I start you with something to drink?" He looked up from his phone, and Isabella found herself caught in the crosshairs of the most unsettling gaze she'd encountered in years. His eyes were dark, almost black in the dim restaurant lighting, and they assessed her with an intensity that felt physical. Not leering. She would have known how to handle that. This was different. This was the look of someone who saw past the uniform and the rehearsed pleasantries, someone who recognized the exhaustion she tried so hard to hide. "Brunello di Montalcino," he said, his voice low and rich, with just enough Italian in the pronunciation to make it clear he wasn't showing off. This was simply how he spoke. "The 2016, if you have it." Of course he would order the most expensive wine on the menu. Isabella noted it on her pad without comment, her expression carefully neutral. "And for dinner?" "I'll need a few minutes." He returned his attention to his phone, dismissing her with the casual ease of someone who had never had to consider whether his dismissals hurt. Isabella walked away, telling herself the heat in her cheeks was irritation and nothing more. She put in the wine order and busied herself with other tables, but she remained hyper-aware of him throughout the evening. He ordered the bistecca alla Fiorentina, rare, and ate with the focused attention of someone who appreciated good food, but didn't feel the need to perform gratitude. He took 2 phone calls during dinner, his conversation clipped and efficient, conducted in Italian too rapid for most of the staff to follow, but perfectly clear to Isabella, who caught fragments despite herself. Business talk, something about a shipment delay and a meeting pushed to Thursday. It was when she brought his espresso, served in the tiny demi-tasse cup that tourists always complained about, that everything changed. "Is there anything else I can get for you?" she asked, setting the cup down with practiced precision. "Actually, yes." He looked up at her, and this time his gaze lingered on her face with open curiosity. "You're Italian, not Italian-American, Italian-Italian. Where from?" The question threw her off balance. "My family is from Sicily, but I was born here." "Your accent when you speak English," he continued, as if she hadn't just tried to shut down the conversation. "Very slight, but it's there. And you understood every word I said on the phone, didn't you?" He smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face from intimidating to devastating. "You were listening." Isabella felt her defenses snap into place like armor. "I was working, not listening. And even if I was, your business is none of mine." "Good." His smile widened. "I prefer people who mind their own business, but I'm curious now. What brings a Sicilian girl to a mediocre Italian restaurant in Manhattan when you could probably be doing something far more interesting with your time and talent?" The presumption in his question, the casual entitlement of it, sparked something hot and reckless in Isabella's chest. She'd been swallowing her pride and her opinions for so long, packaging herself into something palatable for customers and bosses, and clients who saw her as nothing more than a service to be consumed. And here was this man, this stranger in his expensive suit with his expensive wine, making assumptions about her life like he had any right to an opinion. "Rent," she said flatly. "Bills. The same things that bring most people to jobs they're overqualified for." "Will that be all?" She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "I didn't mean to offend you." "You didn't." She looked back at him, her customer service smile back in place, though it felt brittle now, ready to crack. "Will there be anything else?" For a moment, he simply studied her, and Isabella had the uncomfortable feeling that he was cataloging everything about her, the shadows under her eyes, the way her shoulders carried tension like a weight, the slight tremor in her hands that came from too much coffee and not enough sleep. Then he shook his head slowly, almost regretfully. "No, nothing else. Thank you." Isabella walked away feeling oddly unsettled, as if something significant had just happened and she'd missed it entirely. She cleared tables, took orders, smiled until her face hurt, and tried not to notice when he paid his bill and left, leaving behind a tip that was generous but not ostentatious. Not trying to buy anything, just fair. It was past midnight when she finally clocked out, her feet screaming in her sensible work shoes, her lower back a symphony of dull pain. She waited for the night bus on the corner, her coat pulled tight against the October chill, her mind already racing ahead to tomorrow's translation deadline and the stack of bills waiting on her kitchen counter. The streets were still alive with that particular Manhattan energy that never quite dimmed, even in the small hours. She didn't see him again that night. But somehow, Isabella knew, with that particular instinct that lives somewhere between intuition and dread, that the man in the gray suit was going to become a problem. The question was what kind of problem, and whether she had the energy left to deal with it. The second encounter came 3 days later, on a Thursday, that had started badly and spiraled downward from there. Isabella's laptop had died mid-translation, taking with it 2 hours of unsaved work. Her landlord had slipped a rent increase notice under her door, and the cafe where she worked mornings had cut her hours, citing economic uncertainty, while simultaneously hiring the owner's nephew. By the time she arrived at Trattoria Luna for the dinner shift, Isabella's carefully maintained composure was hanging by a thread. She was wiping down menus in the back when Maria, the hostess, poked her head through the doorway, her expression caught between amusement and concern. "Your boyfriend is here. Corner table again." "I don't have a boyfriend," Isabella said automatically, not looking up from the menu in her hands, where someone had spilled what appeared to be marinara sauce across the dessert section. "Well, somebody forgot to tell him that. He asked for you specifically, by name." Maria waggled her eyebrows suggestively. "And honey, if I were 20 years younger and not married to the world's most jealous man, I would be fighting you for that one. Those arms? Madonna. And did you see his—" "I'll take the table," Isabella interrupted, more to stop Maria's commentary than out of any desire to see Matteo Romano again. She checked her reflection in the small mirror by the staff lockers, tucking a strand of dark hair back into her ponytail and attempting to rub some of the exhaustion from her face. It didn't work. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman running on fumes and spite. He was waiting at the same corner table, wearing black this time. Black shirt, black suit jacket draped over the chair, black watch that probably cost more than Isabella made in 6 months. The gold chain at his throat caught the light. His forearms, exposed again where he'd rolled his sleeves, displayed those same intricate tattoos she'd noticed before. Geometric patterns that suggested Italian heritage, mixed with something more personal, more deliberate. Not the impulsive ink of youth, but the chosen markings of a man who understood the permanence of decisions. "Good evening," Isabella said, falling back on professional courtesy because it was safer than anything else. "What can I get you tonight?" "Buonasera, Isabella." His pronunciation of her name was perfect, each syllable given its full weight and music. "Sit down for a moment." "I'm working." "I know. I'm a customer making a request. Sit, please." He gestured to the chair across from him, and something in his tone, not quite commanding but certainly not asking, made Isabella hesitate. She glanced around the restaurant. It was early still, only 2 other tables occupied, both with water and menus, and at least 10 minutes before they'd need attention. Against her better judgment, she sat. "I wanted to apologize," Matteo said, before she could ask what this was about. "For the other night, I was rude. I made assumptions about your situation without knowing anything about you, and that was—" He paused, seeming to search for the right word. "Unacceptable." Isabella blinked, caught completely off guard. In her experience, men like him didn't apologize. They justified, explained, deflected, but they didn't simply admit fault and leave it at that. "Oh, well, thank you, I suppose." "You suppose?" His mouth curved into something that might have been amusement. "That's not exactly a gracious acceptance." "I wasn't aware I needed to be gracious about someone apologizing for their own bad behavior," Isabella shot back, and immediately regretted it. This was a customer. She was supposed to be professional, accommodating, pleasant. But something about him shorted out her usual filters, made her respond with the sharp edge she usually kept carefully sheathed. To her surprise, he laughed, a genuine sound of delight that transformed his entire face. "No, you're absolutely right. I like that. Most people just accept apologies like they're trinkets being handed out. You make me work for it." "I'm not trying to make you do anything," Isabella said, starting to rise from her chair. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I should get back to—" "Wait, please." He held up a hand, and again, Something in the gesture made her pause. "I have a proposal for you, a business proposal." Isabella sat back down slowly, suspicion warring with curiosity. "What kind of business proposal?" "I need a translator. Not just any translator. I need someone who understands both the formal and colloquial registers of Italian. Someone who can navigate technical legal language, but also capture nuance and subtlety. Someone who grew up with the language, who thinks in it, not just speaks it." He leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes intent on her face. "I've been asking around. Maria mentioned you work 2 jobs, that you translate documents freelance, that you studied literature at university, but ended up here." The fact that he'd been asking about her should have raised red flags. Instead, Isabella found herself leaning forward too, drawn in despite her wariness. "What exactly would I be translating?" "Contracts initially. I'm opening a new venture, a cultural center and gallery space in Tribeca. It's a partnership between American investors and Italian cultural institutions. Everything needs to be translated, reviewed, refined. Legal documents, grant applications, exhibition catalogs, correspondence. It's a 6-month project, possibly extending to a year. The pay is..." He named a figure that made Isabella's breath catch in her throat. "Per month." That was more than she currently made from both jobs combined. She stared at him, trying to find the catch, because there had to be a catch. "Why me? There are professional translation agencies that handle this kind of work. People with reputations, portfolios, references. I've met with 3 agencies. They're all competent, they're all expensive, and they're all missing something." He tilted his head slightly, studying her with that same unnerving intensity she remembered from their first meeting. Passion. Understanding. The sense that language is something alive, something that matters beyond just accuracy. When you took my order the other night, you didn't just hear me. You listened. You understood every word I said on the phone. And more than that, you understood the context, the subtext. That's what I need. Not just someone who can translate words, but someone who can translate meaning. Isabella's heart was racing now, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. This was too good to be true. This was exactly the kind of opportunity she'd dreamed about when she first moved to New York. The kind of project that could transform a resume, open doors, prove she was more than just a warm body filling in gaps in the service industry. But she'd learned the hard way that opportunities that seemed too good to be true usually were. "I'd need to see the contracts," she said carefully. "Review the scope of work, the timeline, the terms. I'm not agreeing to anything without understanding exactly what's expected." "Of course." He pulled a business card from his jacket pocket and slid it across the table. Matteo Romano. The card read in elegant letterpress, "Cultural Development." Below that, a phone number, an email address, and an address in Tribeca. "Come by my office tomorrow afternoon, 2 o'clock. I'll have everything ready for review. If you're not interested after seeing the details, no hard feelings. But Isabella..." He caught her eyes again, and she felt that strange flutter in her chest return. "This is legitimate. I'm not trying to trick you or trap you. I'm just trying to build something meaningful, and I think you could help me do that. And I think it could help you too." She took the card, her fingers brushing against his for a brief moment that sent an unwelcome spark of electricity up her arm. "I'll think about it. That's all I'm asking." He sat back, and just like that, the intensity drained from the moment, replaced by easy courtesy. "Now for dinner, I'll have the osso buco, and a bottle of the Barolo this time. The 2015. And before you ask, yes, I know it's expensive. Some things are worth paying for." The way he said it, looking directly at her, made Isabella wonder if he was talking about the wine at all. She took his order and escaped to the kitchen, her mind whirling. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of automatic movements and racing thoughts. By the time she clocked out, she'd talked herself into and out of taking the meeting at least a dozen times. She pulled out her phone on the bus ride home and researched Matteo Romano, finding surprisingly little for someone who carried himself with such authority. A few mentions in business journals about cultural initiatives. A photograph from a charity gala 3 years ago, him in a tuxedo beside an older man identified as his father, Salvatore Romano. References to the Romano family's influential presence in New York's Italian-American business community, a phrase that could mean anything from legitimate success to something considerably darker. But nothing concrete, nothing damning. Just the vague sense that the Romano name carried weight, and that weight could be burden or protection depending on which side of it you stood. That night, lying in her too small bed in her too expensive apartment, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that her landlord kept promising to fix, Isabella made her decision. She would go to the meeting. She would review the contracts. And if everything checked out, if this was truly the legitimate opportunity it appeared to be, she would take it. Not because of Matteo Romano's intense dark eyes or his devastating smile. Not because of the way he said her name like it was something precious. But because she was tired of surviving. She was ready to live again. She just hoped she wasn't making the biggest mistake of her life. The office was not what Isabella expected. She'd imagined something cold and corporate, glass and steel and minimalist furniture that cost more than it should. Instead, she found herself in a converted loft space in Tribeca, all exposed brick and soaring ceilings, filled with natural light streaming through enormous windows that overlooked the Hudson River. Art lined the walls, contemporary Italian pieces mixed with classical prints, carefully curated to suggest both heritage and progress. A restoration work table occupied one corner, covered with what appeared to be fragments of antique frames being painstakingly repaired. Everything about the space suggested passion and attention to detail, the work of someone who genuinely cared about preservation and beauty, rather than simply profiting from them. Matteo was waiting for her at a large wooden table that served as both desk and conference space. Several thick folders spread before him. He'd traded his formal suit for dark jeans and a crisp white shirt. Still polished, but more approachable. Still wearing the gold chain. Still with his sleeves rolled to reveal those tattoos. He looked up when she entered, and his face brightened with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "Isabella, thank you for coming. Coffee? Espresso? I have a machine that actually works, unlike whatever disaster you're probably used to." Despite her nervousness, Isabella found herself smiling. "Espresso would be perfect, thank you." He moved to a professional-grade espresso machine. Of course, he had a professional-grade espresso machine, and began the familiar ritual. Isabella watched his hands work with the precision of practice, the intimate knowledge of temperature and timing that came from growing up with the ritual. "You make your own coffee?" "My assistant thinks I'm insane," he admitted, not looking up from the machine. "But some things shouldn't be delegated. Espresso is sacred. Like family recipes or first kisses or the proper way to argue with someone you care about." He glanced at her then, and something in his expression made her pulse quicken. Some things require personal attention. He brought her the espresso in a proper cup, not the paper nonsense most offices used, and gestured for her to sit. They settled across from each other at the table, and Isabella forced herself to focus on the documents rather than the man presenting them. He walked her through everything methodically: the scope of the translation project, the timeline, the compensation structure, the rights and ownership clauses. It was all exactly as he'd described: legitimate, generous, professionally structured. The Cultural Center project itself was fascinating. A partnership between the Romano family's foundation and several Italian cultural institutions to create a permanent gallery space, artist residency program, and educational center focused on preserving and promoting Italian art, literature, and craft traditions in America. "This is ambitious," Isabella said, looking up from the contracts after her third careful review. This isn't just a vanity project or a tax write-off. This is real. Matteo leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. My father built his reputation in hospitality, hotels, restaurants, that kind of thing. Profitable, certainly, but not particularly meaningful. When he retired last year, he gave me control of the family foundation and told me to do something that mattered. Something that would outlast us. His expression softened with something that looked like vulnerability. Though it disappeared so quickly, Isabella wondered if she'd imagined it. Italy gave my grandparents everything when they had nothing. I want to give something back, but I also want to make sure it's done right, that it honors the craft and the culture, rather than just exploiting it for profit or prestige. That's why you want someone who actually understands the language, Isabella said, understanding dawning. Not just the words, but the weight behind them. The history, the context, the cultural significance. Exactly. He leaned forward again, his dark eyes intense on her face. I can pay someone to accurately translate contratto di prestito, but I need someone who understands the difference between lending and borrowing in Italian culture, who knows that certain phrases carry implications that English equivalents don't quite capture. I need someone who won't just translate documents, but will help me make sure I'm not accidentally offending anyone or missing crucial nuances because I'm trying to bridge two different worlds. Isabella set down the contract she'd been holding, her decision crystallizing with surprising clarity. When would I start? His smile was brilliant, transforming his entire face from attractive to absolutely devastating. Is Monday too soon? They spent the next hour discussing logistics. Isabella would need to give notice at both her current jobs, 2 weeks at the cafe, though Maria would probably let her leave sooner, and the restaurant could find a replacement within a week. Matteo's office had a workspace she could use, complete with computer equipment, reference materials, and access to databases she'd never been able to afford on her freelance budget. The hours were flexible, though there would be occasional evening meetings or events she'd need to attend as the gallery project progressed. He handed her a key card for the building and his direct phone number, written in his own hand on the back of another business card. Call anytime, he said. And I mean that. If you're working on something at midnight and have questions, call me. If you think I'm about to make a cultural faux pas in a meeting, interrupt me. I don't want a translator who's afraid to speak up. I want a partner in this. The word partner hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them seemed ready to address directly. Isabella tucked the card into her bag and stood to leave, feeling lighter than she had in months. This was it. This was the opportunity that would change everything. She made it to the door before his voice stopped her. Isabella? One more thing. She turned back to find him standing at the table, his expression serious now, almost grave. The other night at the restaurant, when I got up to leave, you said something. In Sicilian, under your breath. You thought I didn't hear. Isabella's stomach dropped. She'd been so tired, so irritated by his presumption and his casual assessment of her life. She'd muttered an insult her grandmother had used when particularly exasperated with stubborn men. Testa di ferro arrogante, arrogant iron head. It was juvenile and petty, and she'd regretted it the moment it left her mouth. I apologize. That was unprofessional and— Say it again, he interrupted, taking a step toward her. His eyes were locked on hers, something dark and challenging swirling in their depths. But this time, look at me when you do it. Isabella's breath caught. This was a test, she realized. A challenge. He wanted to see if she would back down, if she would soften herself and make herself smaller to avoid conflict with someone who held power over her. It was what she'd been doing for years, swallowing her opinions, dimming her natural intensity, turning herself into something palatable and unthreatening. She met his gaze directly, lifted her chin, and said clearly, in Sicilian, Testa di ferro arrogante. For a long moment, the office was completely silent. The traffic noise from the street below seemed very far away. Isabella could hear her own heartbeat, loud and insistent in her ears. Matteo's expression was unreadable, his eyes searching her face for something she couldn't name. Then, slowly, his mouth curved into a smile. Not the charming professional smile she'd seen before, but something more genuine, more delighted. "Perfect," he said softly. "Don't ever apologize for that. Not to me, not to anyone. Promise me." Isabella felt something shift inside her chest, some locked door she'd been guarding for years cracking open just slightly. "I promise." "Good." He held her gaze for another beat, and Isabella had the dizzying sense that they were communicating something far more significant than the simple words suggested. "I'll see you Monday, Isabella. And Isabella, I'm glad you came." "So am I," she heard herself say, and was surprised to realize it was true. She left the office feeling like she was floating, her feet barely touching the ground as she made her way to the subway. The October sun was bright overhead, warming the city with that particular golden light that made even the concrete and steel look beautiful. People rushed past her with the typical Manhattan urgency, but for once, Isabella didn't feel like she was drowning in the current. For once, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. That evening, she drafted her resignation letters, professional, grateful, appropriately regretful. She called her nonna in Boston, who answered on the second ring and immediately demanded to know what was wrong, because Isabella never called during dinner hour. When Isabella explained about the new job, about the translation work in the cultural center, her grandmother was silent for a long moment before saying in Italian, "This man, the one who offered you this job, he's the reason your voice sounds different. Lighter. What's his name?" "Matteo Romano," Isabella admitted. "But Nonna, it's not like that. This is purely professional. It's an incredible opportunity and—" her grandmother interrupted, in that particular way that suggested she saw far more than Isabella was saying. "The Romanos are an old family. Powerful. Complicated. Be careful, Tesoro. Sometimes opportunity and danger wear the same face. But also," her voice softened, "sometimes the biggest risk is not taking any at all. You've been so careful for so long, Isabella. So afraid of being hurt or disappointed. Maybe it's time to be brave." After they said goodbye, Isabella sat in her apartment as the sun set over the city, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. Be brave. She'd spent so long just trying to survive that she'd forgotten what it felt like to actually want something, to reach for something beyond mere existence. Matteo Romano was offering her a chance to remember. Whether that made him an opportunity or a danger remained to be seen. Probably, she admitted to herself, as she watched the lights begin to glow across the Manhattan skyline. He was both. And maybe that was exactly what she needed. Isabella's first 2 weeks working for Matteo established a rhythm that was equal parts exhilarating and unsettling. The translation work itself was demanding, but deeply satisfying. Exactly the kind of intellectually stimulating challenge she'd been craving. She spent her days immersed in contracts, grant proposals, and exhibition catalogs, carefully choosing words that would honor both the Italian original and American audience. Matteo had been right about needing someone who understood cultural nuance. Half her job wasn't translation at all, but rather interpretation, explaining why certain phrases that seemed identical on the surface carried completely different weights, depending on regional Italian dialects or cultural context. But it was the time spent working alongside Matteo himself that kept her off balance. He was nothing like she'd expected. Yes, he was demanding. He held everyone, including himself, to impossibly high standards. Yes, he was confident to the point of arrogance. But he was also funny in an understated way, quick with dry observations that made her laugh despite herself. He was genuinely passionate about the Cultural Center project, staying late into the evening to review plans and research potential artists, his enthusiasm infectious. And he asked for her opinion constantly, not as a formality, but because he genuinely valued her perspective, even when she disagreed with him. Especially when she disagreed with him, actually. He seemed to take particular delight in their arguments. "This section about the residency program," Isabella said one afternoon, looking up from her laptop where she'd been reviewing the latest draft. "The Italian version emphasizes tradition and preservation. The English version emphasizes innovation and contemporary practice. Those aren't the same message, Matteo." He looked up from the architectural drawings he'd been studying, his sleeves rolled up as always, a smudge of graphite on his jaw from where he'd been sketching modifications to the gallery space. "They're both important aspects of what we're trying to do." "Yes, but you can't say different things to different audiences and expect it to work. You need to decide what the actual message is, and then say that consistently in both languages." She stood and walked to where he sat, leaning over his shoulder to point at the relevant paragraphs on her screen. "Look, here you're essentially promising the Italian institutions that you'll be a custodian of traditional techniques. Here you're promising American funders that you'll be pushing boundaries and supporting cutting-edge work. Those are potentially contradictory goals." Matteo studied the text, his expression thoughtful. Isabella was acutely aware of how close they were standing, could smell the faint scent of his cologne. Something expensive and subtle. Sandalwood, maybe, with an underlying warmth that suggested spices. "You're right," he said finally. "I've been trying to tell everyone what they want to hear instead of being clear about what I actually want to build." He looked up at her, and this close, she could see flecks of amber in his dark eyes. "So what do I actually want? You've been reading these documents for 2 weeks. You probably understand the vision better than I do at this point." Isabella straightened, putting some necessary distance between them, and considered the question seriously. "You want to create a space where tradition and innovation aren't opposing forces, but rather in conversation with each other, where Italian artists can learn from American perspectives and vice versa, where preservation isn't about amber-freezing culture, but about keeping it alive and relevant. You want—" She paused, searching for the right words. "You want to build a bridge, not a museum. Does that sound right?" His expression had gone very still, very intent. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, rougher around the edges. "Yes, that's exactly right. How did you—" "It's what you actually talk about when you think no one's listening," Isabella said. "When you're on the phone with your architect, or reviewing artist proposals, or sketching ideas on napkins during lunch. You never talk about preservation or innovation separately. You always talk about connection, dialogue, bridge building." For a long moment, Matteo simply looked at her, and Isabella had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing something she hadn't meant to reveal. Then he smiled. Not his usual charming smile, but something smaller and more genuine. "Thank you. For paying attention. For caring enough to pay attention." "That's what you hired me for," she said, her tone deliberately light, trying to reestablish some professional distance. "No," he said quietly. "I hired you to translate documents. This, understanding what I'm actually trying to do, helping me see it more clearly. That's something else entirely. That's something you choose to do." Isabella returned to her desk without answering, her heart beating slightly too fast. Moments like this had been happening with increasing frequency, moments when the professional boundaries they'd carefully maintained seemed to blur into something else, something neither of them was quite ready to name or address. She told herself it didn't mean anything. That intensity and long hours naturally created a sense of intimacy that could be mistaken for something deeper, that Matteo probably had this effect on everyone who worked closely with him, and she was foolish to think she was somehow special. But then there were the other moments, the times when she'd look up from her work to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. The way he remembered details about her life she'd only mentioned in passing. That she preferred her espresso with just a hint of sugar. That she called her grandmother every Sunday evening. That she couldn't work if there was too much noise but needed some background sound or the silence became oppressive. The way he'd started bringing pastries from a specific Sicilian bakery in Brooklyn because he'd noticed her eyes light up when she mentioned it. Small things. Thoughtful things. The kind of things that suggested he was paying attention to her, with the same focused intensity she'd been trying not to pay to him. It all came to a head 3 weeks into the job, during their first major event. The cultural center was still months from opening, but Matteo had organized a preview reception for potential donors, partner institutions, and selected artists. It was held at one of the Romano family's hotels, a boutique property in Soho that had been recently renovated in a style that managed to honor the building's 19th century bones while feeling utterly contemporary. Isabella had been asked to attend as Matteo's translator for the evening, facilitating conversations with the Italian guests and helping to ensure nothing was lost in translation during presentations. She'd bought a new dress for the occasion, spending more than she should have from her first substantial paycheck. It was black, elegant, with a neckline that was professional, but still suggested she possessed collarbones and a figure worth noticing. She'd left her hair down for once, falling in dark waves over her shoulders, and applied makeup with a careful hand. When she arrived at the hotel, she felt nervous in a way that had nothing to do with the work responsibilities of the evening. Matteo was in the lobby talking to the hotel manager when she walked in. He looked up as she approached, and whatever he'd been saying died mid-sentence. His eyes traveled over her once, quickly, before returning to her face with an intensity that made her skin feel warm. "Isabella, you look..." He paused, seeming to search for the right word in either English or Italian, and finding neither language sufficient. "That dress is going to make it very difficult for me to concentrate on business tonight." It was delivered lightly, almost as a joke, but there was something underneath the words that felt heavier, more real. "Thank you," Isabella managed, her voice thankfully steady. "You clean up well yourself." That was an understatement. Matteo in a formal suit was almost unfairly attractive. The jacket was perfectly tailored to his broad shoulders. The crisp white shirt, a stark contrast to his olive skin. His dark hair was swept back as usual, and the gold chain at his throat caught the light. But it was the way he carried himself. The absolute confidence mixed with something that looked almost like anticipation, that made him truly compelling. The evening proceeded smoothly. Isabella fell into the familiar role of interpreter, facilitating conversations between Italian representatives and American donors, explaining cultural references and context where needed. She watched Matteo work the room with practiced ease, seeing new dimensions to him in this context. He was charming, certainly, but there was genuine substance beneath the charm. He spoke about the Cultural Center project with real passion, and when people asked questions, his answers revealed deep knowledge and careful thought. Midway through the evening, during a presentation about the residency program, one of the Italian cultural ministers made a comment in rapid Sicilian dialect, something about hoping the project would respect traditional methods rather than diluting them with American commercial priorities. It was delivered as a polite concern, but there was an edge underneath, a test to see how Matteo would respond. Before Isabella could translate, Matteo answered directly in Italian, his accent flawless, his word choice perfect. He acknowledged the concern, spoke eloquently about the importance of preserving authentic techniques, and then, and this was the brilliant part, gently pushed back, arguing that culture had always evolved through exchange and dialogue, that the masters of Renaissance Italy had been influenced by artists from across Europe and beyond, that tradition wasn't a fixed point, but rather a living conversation between past and present. The minister looked impressed and slightly chastened. Several other Italian guests nodded approval. Isabella felt a surge of something that was definitely not attraction, absolutely not pride, because that would suggest she was emotionally invested in Mateo's success, which she certainly was not. "You didn't need me to translate that," she murmured when they had a moment alone by the bar. "No," he agreed, accepting a glass of Prosecco from the bartender. "But I needed you here anyway. You notice things. You make me better at this." Before Isabella could parse what that meant, they were pulled into another conversation, then another, the evening flowing around them in a blur of introductions and small talk and carefully navigated cultural exchanges. It wasn't until near the end of the night, when most guests had departed and only a few stragglers remained, that Isabella found herself alone with Mateo on the hotel's rooftop terrace, the Manhattan skyline glittering around them like a constellation of earthbound stars. "I think that went well," she said, leaning against the railing and letting the cool October air wash over her face. Her feet were killing her in the heels she'd chosen, but she didn't care. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in years, challenged and engaged and useful. "It went perfectly," Mateo said, moving to stand beside her. "Because of you. You know that, right? You made all of this possible." He gestured vaguely at the skyline, or maybe at the hotel below them, or maybe at something larger, the entire project, the vision, the future they were building together. Isabella turned to look at him, struck by the sincerity in his voice. "I just translated. You did all the actual work." "No." He shifted to face her directly, and suddenly they were very close, the narrow terrace making proximity inevitable. "You do so much more than translate. You understand. You care. You make me think about things differently. He stopped, something complicated crossing his face. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me say it all before you respond." Isabella's heart was suddenly racing. "Mateo, please." His hand came up, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the heat of it. "I know this is complicated. I know I'm your employer, and that makes this inappropriate and probably stupid. But I have to be honest because I'm terrible at pretending. And you deserve honesty. These last 3 weeks working with you have been the best professional experience of my life. But that's not why I look forward to coming to the office every morning. That's not why I find excuses to bring you coffee or stay late reviewing documents we both know are already perfect. I look forward to it because of you. Because you challenge me and surprise me and make me laugh. Because you call me out when I'm being arrogant or short-sighted. Because you said, "Testa di ferro" to my face, and didn't flinch. He was so close now that Isabella could count the individual threads of gold in his chain, could see the precise line where he'd shaved that morning. Her brain was screaming at her to step back, to re-establish boundaries, to remember all the reasons this was a terrible idea. But her body had apparently stopped taking instructions from her brain. "I don't expect you to feel the same way," Mateo continued, his voice lower now, almost intimate. "And I swear this doesn't affect your job. Your position is secure regardless of how you respond. But I needed you to know that this..." He gestured between them. "What I feel when I'm around you, it's not just professional respect. It's more than that. It's been more than that since the moment you told me rent was what brought you to that restaurant. Since you looked at me like I was an idiot for not understanding how hard you were working just to survive. Since you showed me that strength isn't about power or money or reputation. It's about getting up every day and doing what needs to be done even when you're exhausted and scared and not sure how you're going to pay next month's bills." Isabella's breath was coming shallower now. "You're right," she managed. "This is complicated and probably stupid. I know, and inappropriate given our professional relationship. I know that too. And I should tell you to stop talking and never mention this again. You should." His eyes searched her face, waiting. "Are you going to?" Isabella looked at him. Really looked at him. At the man who'd somehow seen past her exhaustion and survival instincts to recognize the person she'd been before New York had worn her down. who'd offered her an opportunity that was exactly what she needed when she needed it most, who brought her Sicilian pastries and argued with her about translations and listened when she explained why certain words mattered, who looked at her not like she was something to be conquered or consumed, but like she was someone worth knowing, worth understanding, worth the risk. "No," she heard herself say. "I'm not going to tell you to stop." The smile that broke across his face was brilliant, transforming him from merely handsome to absolutely devastating. "No? No, because you're not the only one who's terrible at pretending." She took a small step closer, drawn forward by something stronger than caution or common sense. "I tell myself you're just my employer, that I'm just here for the work, but I don't stay late reviewing perfect documents for the work. I don't spend 20 minutes choosing a dress for tonight because of professional responsibility. I don't think about you when I'm supposed to be concentrating on translations. And I definitely don't want to do this because of a job." "Do what?" he asked, though his eyes had gone dark and intent, and she knew he understood exactly what she meant. "This," Isabella said, and kissed him. For one heartbeat, Matteo went completely still, as if surprised despite everything they'd just said. Then his arms came around her, pulling her closer, and he was kissing her back with an intensity that made her knees weak. His mouth was warm and tasted like Prosecco, his hands careful but firm where they touched her back. It felt like falling and flying simultaneously, terrifying and perfect. It felt like admitting something she'd been denying for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Isabella found herself smiling. "This is definitely a complication. The best kind," Matteo agreed, his forehead resting against hers. "Though I should probably clarify something. Earlier when I said I'm not your employer, I meant that. You're not my employee, Isabella. You're my partner in this project, and I'd like you to be my partner in other contexts too, if you're interested." "I'm interested," she admitted, "though I reserve the right to call you testa di ferro arrogante whenever you're being impossible." His laugh was warm against her cheek. "I wouldn't want it any other way." The weeks that followed existed in a strange liminal space between professional partnership and something far more personal. They were careful at the office, maintaining appropriate boundaries during work hours, but after everyone else had gone home, those boundaries dissolved. They stayed late most evenings, ostensibly to work but really to talk. Long, rambling conversations that covered everything from Italian poetry to the best pizza in Brooklyn to childhood memories and dreams neither had dared articulate to anyone else. They ordered takeout at midnight and argued about translations and kissed between paragraphs of contract revisions. It was impractical and probably inadvisable, but it was also the happiest Isabella had been in years. Matteo, she was discovering, was nothing like the intimidating figure she'd first encountered at the restaurant. Yes, he could be commanding and intense in professional contexts, but in private, he was surprisingly vulnerable. He worried constantly about whether the Cultural Center project was truly honoring his grandparents' heritage or just another exercise in wealthy guilt and cultural appropriation. He second-guessed decisions and lay awake at night mentally reviewing conversations for potential missteps. He carried the weight of family expectations with the kind of silent pressure that came from generations of men who'd confused love with control. His father, Salvatore, had built the Romano family business from his own father's small restaurant into a hospitality empire. He'd done it through hard work and careful investments, and, as Matteo admitted carefully one evening, through relationships and leveraged power structures that existed in the gray areas between legitimate and something else. Nothing criminal exactly, but the kind of connections that came with certain expectations and obligations. Matteo had spent his 20s trying to prove himself worthy of the Romano name, taking over struggling hotels and turning them into destinations, earning his father's approval through ruthless efficiency and business acumen. Only recently had he begun to question whether that was actually what he wanted, whether success measured in profit margins was the legacy he hoped to leave. My father thinks I'm wasting the family foundation on vanity projects, Matteo confessed one night, his head in Isabella's lap as they stretched out on the office couch after a particularly long day of meetings. Her fingers were running through his hair in a gesture that had become automatic, comforting for both of them. He doesn't understand why I care about preserving craft traditions or supporting artists who'll never generate significant revenue. He thinks culture is something you consume, not something you invest in. But you don't, Isabella observed. You think culture is something alive, something that needs tending and protecting and room to grow. I think it's what makes us human, he said quietly. I think my grandfather, who came to New York with nothing but recipes and hope, carried more real wealth in his traditions and stories than my father has accumulated in decades of business success. And I think if we lose that, if we let it all become commercialized and homogenized, we lose something essential about who we are. It was conversations like this that made Isabella fall for him, slowly and then all at once. Not the grand gestures or expensive gifts, though Matteo was certainly capable of both, but the quiet moments when he let down his guard and showed her the person underneath the power, the person who cared deeply, who felt things intensely, who was trying so hard to honor his past while building something meaningful for the future. Of course, nothing existed in a vacuum. 5 weeks into their relationship, if that's what they were calling it, Isabella met Matteo's father. It wasn't planned. She'd been at the office on a Saturday afternoon, working through a challenging translation of an exhibition catalog, when Salvatore Romano arrived unannounced. She heard raised voices from Matteo's private office and looked up to see an older man in an immaculate suit, clearly agitated, gesturing emphatically while he spoke rapid Italian. Matteo's responses were quieter, measured, but Isabella could hear the tension underneath. She should have left, given them privacy, but something kept her frozen at her desk, listening despite herself. "This is exactly the problem," Salvatore was saying. "You're so focused on this art project that you're neglecting real business. The Midtown Hotel needs attention. The restaurant group is struggling. And you're here playing curator instead of—" "I'm building something that matters," Matteo interrupted, his voice sharp. "Something that will last beyond quarterly earnings reports. And who's going to see it? Who's going to care?" Salvatore's voice dripped with frustration. "You're a Romano. We built our name on hospitality, on service, on giving people what they want, not on forcing high-minded cultural education down their throats." "Maybe that's the problem," Matteo said, and Isabella heard a door open. "Maybe we've spent so long giving people what they want that we've forgotten to ask what they need." Salvatore emerged first, his face flushed with anger. He noticed Isabella at her desk and stopped, his expression shifting to calculation. "And who's this?" "Isabella Marino," Matteo said, appearing behind his father. His jaw was tight, his eyes flashing with irritation. "She's my partner on the Cultural Center project. Isabella, this is my father." The word partner hung in the air with deliberate ambiguity. Salvatore's gaze swept over her once, assessing, and Isabella fought the urge to shrink under the scrutiny. This was a man accustomed to evaluating people like assets, determining their value and potential utility with ruthless efficiency. "Marino," he repeated. "Sicilian?" "My grandparents immigrated from Palermo," Isabella said, keeping her voice steady and professional. She stood, extending her hand. "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Romano." He shook her hand briefly, his grip firm and impersonal. "And what exactly does a partner on this project do?" "Translation, primarily," Isabella said before Matteo could answer. "Documents, correspondence, cultural consultation, anything that requires bridging Italian and American perspectives." She met his eyes directly, refusing to be intimidated. "Your son is building something remarkable. I'm just helping him communicate it clearly." Salvatore's expression suggested he found this answer marginally acceptable, though hardly impressive. Well, good luck with that. He turned back to Matteo. We'll talk Monday about the Midtown situation. Don't ignore my calls. Then he was gone, leaving behind a wake of expensive cologne and disapproval. In the silence that followed, Isabella and Matteo looked at each other. I'm sorry, he said finally. That was... your father, Isabella finished, who clearly has opinions about how you should be spending your time. He has opinions about everything. Matteo moved to where she stood and pulled her into his arms, resting his chin on top of her head. He's not wrong about some things. I have been neglecting other business concerns. But I can't. He trailed off, frustration evident in the tension of his body. I can't keep living the life he planned for me. I've tried. For years I tried. And I was miserable. Then don't, Isabella said simply, pulling back to look at him. Build what you want to build. Your father will adjust or he won't, but either way, you can't live your life trying to earn approval you're never going to receive. When did you become so wise? He asked, a hint of his usual humor returning. I've always been wise. You've just been too intimidated by my brilliance to notice. He laughed and kissed her, and the tension of the afternoon gradually dissolved into easier conversation, and eventually dinner at a small Italian place in the village, where they sat in the back corner and talked until closing. But Isabella couldn't quite shake the memory of Salvatore's assessing gaze, the sense that she'd been evaluated and found wanting. She understood now, in a way she hadn't before, what it cost Matteo to choose his own path. He wasn't just building a gallery. He was rebuilding himself, creating an identity separate from family expectations and inherited obligations. And she was part of that reconstruction. The knowledge was both thrilling and terrifying. The situation came to a head 2 weeks later, during the first major milestone in the gallery project. They'd secured a significant grant from the Italian Ministry of Culture, contingent on approval of the educational programming. Isabella had spent weeks refining the proposals, working closely with an advisory committee of Italian academics and artists to ensure the programming would meet the ministry's rigorous standards. When the approval came through, it represented not just funding, but validation, proof that what they were building had real cultural value beyond Matteo's personal investment. They celebrated that evening with champagne at the office, just the two of them, the city lights glowing through the windows. Matteo was giddy with relief and excitement, more unguarded than Isabella had ever seen him. We did it, he kept saying, like he couldn't quite believe it. We actually did it. You did it, Isabella corrected. This was your vision. I just helped translate it. No. He pulled her close, his eyes serious despite the champagne warmth in his cheeks. You did so much more than translate. You helped me understand what I was trying to say. You made it better, clearer, more honest. He paused, seeming to search for the right words. You make me better. At everything. I don't know how I did any of this before you. There was something in his voice, some weight behind the words that made Isabella's breath catch. They'd been careful not to put labels on what they were, to keep things light and undefined. But standing there in the empty office with the grant approval sitting on the desk, and Matteo looking at her like she was the reason the city kept turning, Isabella felt the careful distance she'd maintained begin to crumble. I love you, Matteo said, the words coming out rushed and slightly nervous, as if he'd been holding them back for a while, and they'd simply escaped. I know it's fast, and I know this is complicated. But I need you to know. I love you, Isabella. Not just what you do for the project, but who you are. The way you argue with me. The way you say my name when you're exasperated. The way you drink espresso like it's sacred. The way you never let me get away with being anything less than honest. I love all of it. I love you." Isabella stared at him, her mind racing. This was too fast, too intense, too much everything. She should slow this down, establish boundaries, protect herself from inevitable disappointment. She should remember that she'd seen this before. Men who confused intensity with love, who mistook the excitement of something new for lasting commitment. She should be careful. But standing there with Matteo's arms around her and his heart practically visible in his eyes, Isabella didn't want to be careful. She wanted to be brave, like her grandmother had told her. She wanted to fall with someone who might actually catch her, instead of letting her hit the ground alone. "I love you too," she whispered. "Testa di ferro arrogante." His laugh was joyful and relieved, and then he was kissing her with the kind of intensity that made the whole world disappear. They made love right there in the office, on the couch where they'd spent countless evenings talking, surrounded by blueprints and translation drafts and all the evidence of what they'd built together. It felt like a declaration, not just of love, but of commitment to whatever complicated, imperfect thing they were creating together. Afterward, lying tangled together with the city humming below them, Matteo traced patterns on her bare shoulder. "Move in with me," he said quietly. "I know it's too soon to say things like that, but I'm saying it anyway. I want to wake up with you. I want to come home to you. I want all of it." Isabella's first instinct was to refuse, to insist they take things slowly, maintain separate spaces, keep some part of herself protected just in case. But that was the old Isabella talking, the woman who'd been beaten down by too many disappointments, who'd learned to expect the worst because the worst kept finding her. This Isabella, the one Matteo had helped her rediscover, wanted different things. She wanted risk and hope and possibility. She wanted him. "Yes," she said, "but I'm keeping my apartment for 6 months, just in case." "Just in case of what?" "Just in case you get tired of me using all the hot water and leaving books everywhere and cursing in Sicilian when I'm frustrated." He pulled her closer. "Never going to happen." 6 months later, Isabella stood in Matteo's apartment, their apartment, getting ready for the Cultural Center's inaugural exhibition opening. The space was beautiful, a Tribeca loft with soaring ceilings and river views, filled with art and books, and the kind of thoughtful details that revealed two people learning to share a life. Her clothes hung in the closet beside his suits. Her espresso machine, better than his, much to his chagrin, had pride of place in the kitchen. Her photographs joined his family pictures on the walls. It was a life she'd never quite let herself imagine, one that felt both thrillingly new and comfortably inevitable. The past months had been intense. Moving in together had revealed all the small irritations and adjustments that came with intertwining lives. Matteo was obsessively organized in some ways, and completely chaotic in others. He left coffee cups everywhere, and had strong opinions about proper pasta cooking techniques. Isabella discovered she was territorial about workspace, and needed alone time to recharge in ways that had nothing to do with him. They argued, frequently, passionately, in multiple languages. But they also learned each other's rhythms, created rituals, built something sturdy beneath the initial intensity. The cultural center itself had opened 2 months ago, and the response had exceeded even Matteo's ambitious hopes. The programming Isabella had developed attracted serious artists and scholars while remaining accessible enough to draw curious locals. Reviews praised the space for successfully bridging high culture and community engagement, for creating something that honored Italian traditions while remaining vigorously contemporary. Most importantly, it felt alive, always full of people talking, creating, learning. Matteo's vision had become reality, and watching him move through the space he'd built, seeing the quiet satisfaction on his face, filled Isabella with pride that had nothing to do with her own contributions. But tonight was special. Tonight's exhibition, Crossing Borders, Contemporary Italian Artists in Dialogue, represented the culmination of everything they'd been working toward. Established Italian artists paired with emerging American talents, each collaboration exploring themes of heritage, translation, and cultural exchange. Isabella had been deeply involved in the curation, using her linguistic and cultural expertise to help forge connections between artists who might not otherwise have found common ground. "You look beautiful," Matteo said, appearing in the bathroom doorway. He was already dressed, wearing a black suit that made him look criminally attractive, his hair styled in that perfect, slightly messy way that suggested effortless elegance. The gold chain at his throat caught the light. His shirt sleeves were already rolled to reveal his forearms, and those tattoos she'd traced with her fingers countless times. "Though I'm biased." "You're very biased," Isabella agreed, smoothing the red dress she'd chosen for tonight. It was bolder than her usual choices, the color vibrant and confident. 6 months ago, she wouldn't have worn something this attention-drawing. But 6 months ago, she'd been a different person, or rather, a diminished version of herself. Matteo had helped her remember she was allowed to take up space, to be seen, to be proud of what she'd accomplished. "Do you think your father will come?" Matteo's expression flickered with something complicated. His relationship with Salvatore remained strained. The older Romano had never explicitly approved of the cultural center, though he'd stopped actively undermining it. And he'd never quite warmed to Isabella, though he'd learned to treat her with cool professional courtesy. He said he'd try, but he's in Boston for a business meeting, so. He shrugged, trying to project indifference that didn't quite ring true. "Either way, tonight is going to be incredible. We've done something really special, Isabella." "You've done something special," she corrected, moving to straighten his collar unnecessarily, just wanting an excuse to touch him. "I just helped with the words." "You keep saying that, and you keep being wrong." He caught her hands in his dark eyes intense on her face. "This whole project exists because you understood what I was trying to say before I could articulate it myself. You took a wealthy guy's guilty conscience and helped me turn it into something meaningful. You made me believe I could build something that honored my heritage without being trapped by it. He paused, swallowing hard. "You changed my life, Isabella. In every possible way." She kissed him softly, tasting the familiar warmth of his mouth, feeling the familiar flutter in her chest that still hadn't faded. "We changed each other's lives. That's how this works." The exhibition opening was spectacular. The gallery was crowded with collectors, critics, artists, cultural officials, and curious members of the public. Isabella spent the evening in her element, translating conversations, facilitating introductions, watching connections form between people who'd approached the exhibition from wildly different perspectives. She noticed Matteo across the room, completely in his element too, discussing artistic techniques with a painter from Milan, while simultaneously charming a skeptical New York Times critic. He caught her eye and smiled, that particular smile that was just for her, the one that said, "We did this together." Midway through the evening, Isabella found herself standing alone for a moment in front of her favorite piece from the exhibition, a collaborative installation by a Sicilian ceramicist and a Brooklyn sculptor. The work explored themes of fragmentation and reconstruction, using broken pottery shards reassembled into new forms that honored their traditional origins while creating something entirely contemporary. It was, Isabella thought, a perfect metaphor for what she and Matteo had built together, taking pieces of heritage and history and loss and assembling them into something new and whole. "Impressive work," said a voice beside her, and Isabella turned to find Salvatore Romano studying the installation with an expression that was difficult to read. She hadn't realized he'd come after all. "My son tells me you were very involved in selecting the pieces for this exhibition." "I helped connect artists," Isabella said carefully, always slightly on guard around Matteo's father. But the vision was Matteo's. The space itself, the programming philosophy, all of that came from him. Salvatore continued studying the ceramic installation. "You know, I didn't understand what he was trying to do here. I thought it was wasteful, impractical, self-indulgent. Rich man's hobby. He turned to look at her directly. I was wrong. This is... He gestured at the crowded gallery, the animated conversations, the clear evidence of genuine cultural engagement. This is something real, something that matters. My son did this, with your help. It was probably the closest thing to approval Isabella had ever heard from him. He's incredibly talented, she said quietly. And he cares deeply about honoring his family's heritage while building something new. That's not easy. It requires courage. It requires someone who believes in him, Salvatore corrected. Someone who sees past the family name and the family business and the family expectations to the person underneath. My wife used to do that for me before she passed. I'd forgotten what it looked like. He paused, and for just a moment, his expression softened into something almost vulnerable. Take care of him, Isabella. My son is stronger than I gave him credit for. But he's also more fragile than he lets on. He needs someone who understands both. Before Isabella could respond, Salvatore had moved away, leaving her standing alone with a lump in her throat. Across the room, she saw Matteo searching for her through the crowd. When their eyes met, his face lit up with such pure joy that Isabella felt her own heart expand to accommodate the feeling. She pushed through the crowd to reach him, and he immediately pulled her close, his arm around her waist. There you are, he murmured against her hair. I was looking for you. I was talking to your father, she said, still processing the brief conversation. I think he just gave us his blessing. Sort of. Matteo pulled back to look at her, surprise evident on his face. Really? What did he say? That you're stronger and more fragile than he realized. That you need someone who understands both. She reached up to touch his face, feeling the familiar scratch of evening stubble against her palm. He's right, you know. You act so confident, but underneath you're constantly worried about whether you're doing enough, being enough, honoring the past while building the future. It's exhausting watching you carry all that weight. I'm not carrying it alone anymore, Matteo said, covering her hand with his own. That's what you don't seem to understand, Isabella. Before you, I was doing all of this by myself. Making decisions in isolation, second-guessing everything, trying to prove something to people who didn't care about what I was actually trying to build. But with you... He paused, and she saw him gather his courage for something. With you, everything makes sense. You're not just my translator or my partner in the cultural center. You're my partner in life. You're the person who makes me believe I can be both a Romano and myself. You're... He stopped talking, and suddenly dropped to one knee, right there in the middle of the crowded gallery, pulling a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. The conversations around them gradually quieted as people noticed what was happening. Isabella felt her breath catch, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. Isabella Marino, Matteo said, his voice carrying through the suddenly silent gallery. You walked into my life cursing me in Sicilian, and I knew immediately that you were going to change everything. You challenge me and support me, and call me out when I'm being an arrogant idiot. You made me want to build something meaningful instead of just something profitable. You taught me that honoring heritage doesn't mean being trapped by it. You showed me what it means to be truly brave. Not fearless, but afraid, and doing it anyway. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. Will you marry me and spend the rest of your life arguing with me in multiple languages? Isabella looked down at him. This man who'd somehow seen past her exhaustion and defenses to recognize the person she'd been trying so hard to remain. This man who'd offered her not just a job, but a purpose. Not just security, but a partnership. This man who loved her temper and her intensity, and her habit of cursing in Sicilian when she was frustrated. She thought about her grandmother's advice 6 months ago. Sometimes the biggest risk is not taking any at all. Yes, she said, her voice shaking with emotion but clear and certain. Yes, you arrogant, wonderful, impossible man. Yes. The gallery erupted in applause as Matteo stood and slipped the ring, a simple band with a single perfect diamond, onto her finger. Then he kissed her with such tenderness that Isabella felt tears slip down her cheeks. When they finally broke apart, she was laughing and crying simultaneously. "You proposed to me in front of all these people," she said, half exasperated, half delighted. "You couldn't have waited for a private moment." "I wanted everyone to see," Matteo said, grinning. "I wanted witnesses. I wanted the whole world to know that Isabella Marino, who once called me testa di ferro arrogante, and meant it, agreed to spend her life with me. That's the kind of miracle that needs to be documented." "You're ridiculous," she said, but she was smiling through her tears. "You love me anyway." "Unfortunately, yes, I do." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and champagne toasts and delighted conversations. Isabella caught sight of Salvatore at one point, standing at the edge of the crowd, and was surprised to see him smiling. Actually smiling, as he watched his son celebrate. He caught her eye and raised his glass in a small salute, acknowledgement and approval, finally, freely given. As the night drew to a close and guests gradually departed, Isabella found herself back in front of the ceramic installation with Matteo beside her, his arm around her waist, the unfamiliar weight of the engagement ring on her finger. "We did it," she said softly. "We built something beautiful." "We're building something beautiful," Matteo corrected. "This is just the beginning. The gallery, the marriage, the life. It's all just starting, and I can't wait to see what we create together." Isabella leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, breathing in his familiar scent. 6 months ago, she'd been exhausted and defeated, serving wine to indifferent customers and barely surviving. Now she was standing in a gallery she'd helped build, wearing an engagement ring from a man she loved deeply, surrounded by evidence that beautiful things could emerge from broken pieces if you were willing to do the work of reassembling them. "Say it one more time," Matteo murmured against her hair. "For luck." Isabella laughed, knowing exactly what he meant. She pulled back just enough to look him in the eye, channeling every ounce of exasperated affection she felt, and said clearly in Sicilian, "Testa di ferro arrogante." Matteo's smile was brilliant. "That's my girl. Now let's go home." And so they did. Home to their shared apartment, their intertwined lives, their complicated, imperfect, absolutely perfect future. Isabella had cursed him quietly in Sicilian that first night, and he'd grinned and told her to say it again but looking at him. She'd spent the month since looking at him, really looking, and finding someone worth every risk, every vulnerability, every brave choice. Sometimes love didn't announce itself with trumpets and guarantees. Sometimes it arrived disguised as irritation and insult, and only revealed its true nature slowly, in stolen moments and shared work, and the gradual realization that you'd found someone who made you want to be the fullest version of yourself. Sometimes the man you cursed in Sicilian turned out to be the man who'd help you remember how to dream again. And that, Isabella thought as they walked hand in hand through the Manhattan streets toward home, was the best kind of unexpected ending, which was really just another way of saying beginning.